Hello, everybody. How are you doing today? This is D. Durrell with D. Durrell Life Solutions. I'm happy to be here to have a discussion today. It's been a while, it's been almost a week, and I want to have a conversation and also some more interaction with the autism community. I have done further study into some things that I wanted to talk about. Just getting away from my practical experience, clinical experience with people who have developed autism. Most of my experience with autism is with people who are more on a higher functioning level, primarily those who have autism along with other behavioral disorders, personality disorders, or anxiety disorders, etc., etc. And so I thought about things and I thought about gaining more clarity as a means of building a bridge with the autism community on YouTube. And I do know with my personality and the way that I engage, I can become a little theatrical. I can become a bit a bit emotional. I can become even a bit arrogant. And I do understand from the autism community that you all have lived with this condition. I'm not going to say illness. I'm not going to say mental illness, because I do understand, as I reflected on things, the sensitivity of the community. And so, as I continue to talk about autism, which I will, along with other mental illnesses, because I kind of thought about when I'm looking at intellectual disorders, which autism is not. It's a communication, or what we call in the past pervasive disorder. It's a communication disorder. I can remember just reflecting that it was a time that we used the term retarded, mentally retarded, for people who suffered from intellectual deficits. Now we use the term intellectual deficit disorder. We have grown to relabel conditions, I'm not going to say illnesses, but conditions in which people were born with or genetically inherited from the time that they were born or early in their childhood. In one of the exchanges that I encountered with a person who, well, actually two people who have children that are autistic, there seemed to have been an understood notion to not define autism as a mental illness. And so, as I reflected and undergone some level of introspection as a professional, clinically, I can empathize. And I'm going to say that again. I can empathize with those who refuse to allow the APA, the American Psychological Association, those who have psychologists, psychiatrists, mental health professionals like myself at the master's level. You have the right to not want to acknowledge that term for your child. Okay? You have the right to. I'm not saying that you're totally 100% correct, but you do have the right to. And I have been in the profession that I'm in. I have to respect that. And in my interaction, I will speak in a manner that makes you comfortable. I'm going to speak in a manner in which you're accustomed to, based on the fact that this is your loved one. So you basically are going through this journey simultaneously with them. Now, I have a question for many of you. And if I am able to do that for you, in exchange, you cannot look at me as an outsider of the autism community because I don't have a child or a relative, which I actually do have a relative. I have a niece by marriage who's actually around, I want to say she's about 10 or 11 years old. And you don't have a lot. Most autistic children are actually males. And she's a female, lives in Louisiana, Baton Rouge. And she has been diagnosed with autism probably around 3 or 4 years old. She is more on the lower functioning, nonverbal level. And I have spent some time whenever I saw her educating the family on how to interact with her. Okay? There was a great deal of things that bothered me in the interaction with her that was not consistent clinically with what I would propose as far as parenting, monitoring, interaction. There was a lot of frustration among some of the family members as far as how she interacted with others, not understanding, attempting to question why she won't respond back. You know, there was a lot of things that were very irritable for me to see. And unfortunately, that was one of the few times in which, as a clinician, I got into my counseling bag and became counselor and not just derail, the relative, the cousin, and everything else. I went professional. They didn't like it. But I felt that in that position, I'm not going to allow you to allow the children and other adults to mistreat this angel. So, as I reflected over the past week, I looked at it, I personalized it from my own experience with a relative that had this disorder, that has this condition, I would say. But I would ask for reciprocity from those that do not agree with me. My stance is not going to change professionally towards autism. However, I do understand your perspective, and I can carry a certain level of flexibility. A certain level of flexibility in this interaction and understanding the sensitivity and the awareness that you have, being that obviously you all have read research, some good and bad, and I know you may not want to hear that, but you all have to understand that there are limitations that you all possess. There are skills that you don't possess. There's practical application of treatments that you're not qualified to do so, including diagnosing. I am not, and I'm going to say this to the autism spectrum community, I will never in my 23 years of working in mental health, encourage anyone to self-diagnose, and I am not willing to sacrifice and to part away from my training and my ethical understanding of what we as therapists and people should and should not do as it involves mental health. I'm not willing to part way, or I'm not willing in any way to compromise that, and I will not. And I know for some of you, and I've seen your interactions online, some of you in the autism community are very inflexible. But I am going to also be inflexible when it comes to that. There's no way that I'm going to compromise that when I know clinically and I know practically, educational-wise and so forth, that self-diagnosing is not an official diagnosis. It's not an official diagnosis, nor is it respected by insurance companies, educational institutions, and the profession itself. If you receive treatment or your loved one is receiving treatment and you have an unofficial diagnosis, that child will be evaluated to see if they actually have that diagnosis or it's other things. Now, I want us to understand as we go through this journey of having dialogue, and I want to increase the dialogue with the autistic community, that there will always be continuous research. There will always be pertinent research, valuable research that will paint a better picture from one year to another or in cycles. I think in the early 1940s, as we're looking at autism, there was another illness that was called Asperger's disorder or syndrome that was seen as a milder or a higher functioning form of autism. Okay? Matter of fact, I'm going to place the puzzle and put the pieces together to give rise to why I'm talking about Asperger's, which is no longer an official illness. Also, I want to point out that in Great Britain in 2013, that country also decided not to allow Asperger's to be an official disorder in the DSM. Or they have an international classification system that's different. So this is also not just in the United States, but this is also international. Now, let's transition back to the fact that Asperger's was seen as a higher form of autism. We called it Asperger's disorder. As the research and more research was compiled, when there was a update from the DSM 4TR, which actually was the last time that Asperger's was listed as an illness. Asperger's disorder was listed. It was listed as a communication disorder, or you want to say a pervasive developmental disorder, which is the PDDs. And the research was inconclusive overall as it relates to in a continuum of this illness being classified. And so in that research, what was inconsistent or inconclusive was the fact that there was no real significant differences between what was classified as Asperger's and autism. There were a great deal of similarities. And they felt that in that, we've decided to connect the two together and to create a spectrum of what's lower functioning to higher functioning. And so they, again, at that time in the DSM-4 TR, and prior to that, in the previous DSMs, there was a difference in which that was autism disorder, autistic disorder, and then there was Asperger's. In the formation of the DSM-5, they decided to combine those disorders together. And now we have autism spectrum disorder. So when we talk about a spectrum, we're looking at a range from low to high, a range of behaviors. And so the research just basically didn't indicate a need to continue with this particular disorder. And also, unfortunately, I also have to say this, there was some economic influences as relates to insurance companies, the medical industry, and so forth, as they all made a decision with this, that there was no significant differences. So what we're going to do is we're going to combine this together and call it a spectrum. A spectrum meaning it has a range. Okay? Now I do want to highlight that as we're talking about pervasive developmental disorders, which are under the family of communication disorders, that we want to point out the key points of why there is a spectrum or a range, a behavioral range that comprise of autism spectrum disorder. And so we want to look at the fact that we got to look at the social impairment, interaction. We also have to look at the gestures, body posture, the inability to develop relationships and have communication. Being preoccupied with objects and repetitive and or stereotypical type behaviors. And I know, guys, as I talk about this, some of you all, as I spoke the last time, which is consistent with the DSM, as I am now, no, you don't know this and know that. Deidre, you got it all. No, I'm not. I don't have anything wrong. If you're telling me I have it wrong, then you're telling the psychologist who basically established the research for years and years, because there are people who've been researching autism for 20, 30, 40 years. If you're telling me I'm wrong, you're telling them that they're wrong, because I am basically reviewing the research. This is not my words. This is the research. This is the DSM classification. This is the DSM classification. You know, we're talking about failure to have relationships, verbal, nonverbal cues, picking up those type of things. And so merely when we're looking at Asperger's, it merely has the same thing. It's basically the same thing. There's only a few differences as it relates to significant delays or cognitive development things of that sort, or when we talk about age appropriate skills, because this is a higher form of it. People who had Asperger's, who are now in the autism spectrum, are the higher functioning, are now the higher functioning individuals at this point. So I want the autism community, as I am highlighting this, I want to say the illness changed around 2010 to 2012, I think. It was somewhere around 2010 to 2012 that Asperger's was taken out. I'm not sure, but it was around that time. It was the early 2010s. So why are we not talking about those who once had Asperger's? And because it is redefined, now you have autistic spectrum disorder. There's a spectrum. We no longer say, we're no longer saying, we're no longer saying Asperger's anymore. So now one day you had it. Matter of fact, I remember vividly, I was working with a social service agency, and they were upset and trying to figure out why would they change Asperger's, take the term Asperger's out and just say autistic spectrum disorder. And so the insurances and clinicians automatically gave that label. They may have gave another provisional label before they diagnoses, before they decided to use autistic spectrum disorder per se. Everybody's different. I don't know, but they could have done that. They could have just changed the codes on that and move forward with the treatment, because the treatment pretty much didn't change for the most part. We're still utilizing ABA therapy, applied behavioral analysis. You're still using some cognitive therapy, mainly behavioral therapies, which I use. That doesn't change. So I want to be curious. I want to hear from the autistic community. For those who were once diagnosed with Asperger's, who are now on the autism spectrum. Because that's not talked about. That is not talked about. And I want to preface once again that the autism community that I know personally, people who are in the autistic community, do not engage the same way as those online. I'm sorry, but many of you are somewhat delusional at points in your interaction. You need a break. You need some respite away from things. There's nothing wrong with taking a break from this. And you have to understand, no matter how many trainings and educational classes that you take online, etc., it does not replace getting degrees, particularly at the master's and PhD level, and undergoing people who have been clinically trained and educated and going through whatever pathway that they had to matriculate from in order to become bona fide psychiatrists, psychologists, therapists, social workers. I'm sorry, there's no replacing that. I take offense to that, and I understand you don't care about that. You don't have to, but I do. So I will function as I am supposed to. And I'm not going to budge or compromise ethically what I know to be the right thing to do to fit something that's on YouTube. And also the fact that I've never encountered this type of interaction in real life. So I'm going to say that the minority of the autism community is online. The average person that is functioning with this conditioning or living with those that are functioning in this condition, their behavior is not consistent with the minority online. And I'm saying that because I've been treating kids with autism and adults for the last 16 years, on and off. Not consistently all the time, but on and off. So I'm going to say that with a great deal of confidence. So I just basically wanted to have this discussion. I wanted to have this discussion so that as I continue to talk about autism, which I will not talk about it like, say, all the time, but it will come up at least once or twice a month. I may revert on some things that involve autism. And I will give clarity on these things. I may bring up some situations in which entertainers such as Tony Braxton, who has an autistic child, and others that have kids with some type of intellectual deficit disorder or pervasive disorder, communication, and so on. The last situation involved Chris Rock when he had an unofficial diagnosis of, I think it was some type of social delayness or communication illness that was not necessarily in the DSM. It's been reviewed by the medical field, but it's not official. Maybe when they update the DSM to the DSM-6 or the DSM-5, something else, 5R, whatever they may decide to do, they may add that in. They may add other different illnesses because based on how your society is configured and the stressors that are present, new illnesses can come into fruition. Okay? New illnesses, new ways of disrupting one's life based on the social structure, technology, family structure, or catastrophes. New things can come about. So I hope that this was a conversation that we can continue. I want those who are listening to please leave a comment in the comment section. I welcome it. I may do a live stream asking anyone that has an autistic child or personal interaction, to come on my panel and we can have a discussion. We can have a autism related discussion. But what I won't have is someone getting angry at me because I didn't say something or use a certain phrase that you don't like, although in my profession, it is pretty much the norm or the standard. I'm not going to say or do anything that's outside of the standard of my training. I will not. So with that being said, guys, this is D. Durrell with D. Durrell Life Solutions. I hope you all have a great day. I'm looking forward to having an exchange about this topic in the comment section. Please subscribe and share.